Please have a seat. I'm going to invite Hilary forward, and we're going to be hearing from Philippians chapter 4, verses 4 to 9.
Final exhortations. Rejoice in the Lord always. I will say it again. Rejoice. Yet let your gentleness be evident to all. The Lord is near. Do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. And the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. Finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things. Whatever you have learned or received or heard from me or seen in me, put it into practice, and the God of peace will be with you.
Do not be anxious. Yeah, right. Easier said than done. And anxiety is so widespread, isn't it? You could say it's endemic. You know, look around in this country and all ages. I was going to say the younger people, but there seems to be more on younger people's plates than there was in my day. But through all generations, anxiety is rife. And a pandemic, when we see the cost of living throughout the world, and actually with Thanksgiving, how relatively okay it is for some here. The health services under struggle, wars, crime. I remember anxiety as well. Thank you for being open about that. And for me, it was most rife at school. And that's what led to that school phobia. And really painful. Yeah, I'd rather have had a broken leg than go through the mental health struggles that I went through. And as a probation officer as well, actually 2 or 3 times throughout that time. And I kept it to myself and my counsellor and to Kate, but some real struggles with anxiety that I'm glad that level, that scale is in the past. I've learned to cope better over the years. But it remains, again, as Emma said, it remains part of everybody's life. How about you? How is your relationship with anxiety? Well, I've got a message from Paul this morning. Just stop it. Don't be anxious about anything. Telling somebody not to be anxious is ever so unhelpful. A bit like telling somebody who's depressed to pull themselves out of it. No empathy, no understanding. In Philippians, I don't read this as a command from Paul and from God through Paul. Do not be anxious. But I read it more as a reassurance. This is why you need not be overly anxious. How we read Bible verses and how we read the Bible shapes our theology. It's one of the important ways that our theology, how we see God, is shaped. We read this and we get a better understanding of God, what God is like. But how we read the Bible is also shaped by our theology, what we think God is like. Would God, in your mind, say, you stupid thing, stop being so anxious, pull yourself together, you wimp. Stop letting the side down. We've got a lot to do in this world. Stop letting me down. Call yourselves a proper Christian? Or is it more like, I love you. I understand. firsthand. I'm near you. I'm with you. I will help you with your struggles, with your anxiety, and you will find peace in me. We will get through this together. I will help protect your precious mind and your precious heart. A bit like a parent holding the hand of a loved child who is in an anxiety-provoking situation. The child is reassured by the parent, their bigness, their presence, their comforting words, their reassurance, and not an impatient, stop being such a scaredy cat. I found it helpful this week to think about what's the difference between fear and anxiety. When I was very, 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 very young, far too young to get into an X film as we had in those days, my older sisters snuck me into the cinema to see Jaws, and it was petrifying. Some of you will relate to that. I still hear the music when I go in the water. It had such an impact on me that I had anxiety swimming off Folkestone Beach whenever I went there. I could see the fin in my imagination. That's anxiety. It wasn't based on what I saw in reality. It wasn't based on actually a definite threat. And I still get anxious when I'm paddleboarding off the coast here. When I'm on my own and it's all quiet, I kind of like, are there any shadows? But I think in reality, I'm more in danger of all the pollution coming from the water companies. Fear is different. When Kate and I were fortunate enough to train in scuba diving on the Barrier Reef in Australia many years ago, we had this dive at night which was petrifying, and the guides were telling us all the sharks come out at night, and they do. And on one occasion, I remember 8 of us being down there, and somebody did the dreaded sign. Shark. And I was at the back of the line. I've told some of you this. I was at the back of the line. They were all swimming that way. I was kind of going really fast to try and get... I got to the front of the line, really brave. And they'd actually been following a shark. So I was close to it. I saw a shark and I felt fear because that was reality. The difference between an actual threat, fear, and a possible threat, anxiety. I saw this quote the other day. Fear relates to a known or understood threat, whereas anxiety follows from an unknown, expected, or poorly defined threat. Your uneasiness in this situation would be caused by anxiety related to the possibility of something bad happening, rather than an immediate threat. The anxiety stems from your mind's interpretation of the possible dangers. Whether we feel anxiety or fear or both, because they do overlap, it can have a very similar emotional, physical effect. When we fear something, when we see that lion or that shark or that person with a knife or something more day-to-day, we have that fight or flight. The autonomic nervous system goes into effect. But the body is amazing. The mind is amazing. Once the threat has gone, the body goes back to normal most often. So fight or flight, back to normal. The real killer with anxiety, and it can be a killer, is that it's ongoing often. It takes its toll physically, emotionally. It is so powerful. I love this quote, which is attributed to various different people, Mark Twain, maybe Winston Churchill, who said, "I am an old man and have known a great many troubles, but most of them never happened." The power of the mind to conjure up what might or might not happen. The context of this letter, so maybe about 25, 30 years after the death and resurrection of Christ, the days of the early church, why might the Christians Philippi be anxious? Well, because of the real possibility and the growing threat of persecution. Because of internal strife, people were falling out within the church. No, surely not. Yes, they were. Because of false teaching that was going around. Things were getting out of control. And, as Emma touched upon, control and anxiety are very, very much linked. First of all, first thought for this morning, peace isn't found in our trying to take control. Usually, not often, usually we will try and cope with our anxiety by trying to take control. It can be conversations. Some of us might feel anxious normally in a conversation with somebody else. How do we cope with that anxiety? We control the conversation. Keep on talking, don't let them get a word in edgeways. And then you're unlikely to get caught out by what they say or by what emotions arise in you. We control conversations sometimes. Relationships. Anxiety can be behind a lot of controlling behaviour in relationships, often unconscious. But we control another to protect ourselves from what possibly could go wrong. Avoiding anything new. Does this relate? Avoiding different things that we aren't familiar with, we aren't competent at, because if we feel competent, then we have less anxiety. It's actually why counselling might be avoided as well, therapy might be avoided, because when you're sitting opposite the counsellor, you don't always feel in control of what's going to arise, what emotions you're going to feel, even what questions they're going to ask. And that's often why somebody will flee counselling in the early days, having done 1 or 2 sessions. By avoiding other things. And yes, that crushing anxiety I had at school led to me avoiding so much school. Surprised I passed any exams. I think I was anxious about not getting any exams, so that motivated me as well. For some people, it's social gatherings. The thought of going to a social gathering produces so much anxiety, so they might avoid it altogether. Public speaking. Who loves public speaking? Yes, Mike, we all love it. We never get anxious. Actually, I think anxiety can help us when we're public speaking. And I will always have an element of anxiety. But doing it anyway, doesn't matter if you get those dry lips, those shaky knees, those fears when anybody listens to a word I'm saying. When I started preaching, I only remembered this morning, afresh, 26 years ago, I went to the doctors and asked for beta blockers because I noticed when I was standing up here, I was shaking. Nobody else noticed, but I noticed. And my lips got so dry, I was drinking water all the time. Going to a different job causes anxiety, so sometimes people stay in the same job forever. We sometimes try to console anxiety by having rituals. Gives us a sense of control. Maybe superstition. I'm not walking under that ladder because I'm in control here. I don't walk under that ladder, nothing bad will happen. It's behind OCD as well, obsessive compulsive disorder. If I switch the light on 3 times, if I wash my hands 4 times, and so on. That kind of sense of control. It comes into religion, into churches. That's why people resist change in church, because it means we're out of control. Why people stick to rigid doctrine. I'm not going to change my thinking because I won't be in control anymore. Where will it lead? Why we close our minds so often in church? Because we heard this one. You're on a slippery slope. Forgetting that as children, slippery slopes can be such fun and rarely lead to tragedy, sometimes lead to a new place, which is a good place. Christians can get into trying to control things by naming and claiming. I've named and claimed that, so God is going to do it. Back in control. Or God told me. God told me to do this, to go there. Can be right, but actually sometimes it's our imagination helping us feel, well, God told me, so it's going to be okay. giving prophecies to people too quickly. And I've seen this tragically when friends have been dying, because it seems to bring back control to this really awful, uncomfortable situation. Unless you already know this, it might be shocking, but all this control is an illusion of control, because our control actually is very limited. So what's the answer then? Actually, it's counterintuitive, the answer. It goes against the grain and what all of us try to do. The answer is letting go of control often. Learning to become more uncomfortable, or rather more comfortable with uncertainty. Bit of a Freudian slip there. Learning to become more open to the unknown. To actually, with eyes open, recognising the unpredictability of life. Recognising that none of us have all the answers. To be open to the new. And what's the wonderful thing that goes on when we become more like that with God's help? There's a deepening trust in God. And the character of God. What is God like? Secondly, peace doesn't come from expecting God to take over control. This might go against quite a bit of our teaching over the years, or people's teaching or expectations. Peace doesn't come from expecting God to take over control. Not as simple as give it over to God, leave it to God to sort out, and our problems will disappear or might not arise in the first place. It's so tempting to think that. And to actually see that as faith and trust. But again, I would suggest it's more about being open to God. We can work things out together. Whatever comes our way and whatever problems remain. But I do know, and I've been there and can get there as well, I know people can get some level of comfort, however fragile it is in reality, from believing, from convincing ourselves that God has total control of everything. It feels heretical to even suggest that God doesn't have control of everything. What do you think? If God is all-controlling in that way, why on earth the earthquake? Why on earth all the deaths and misery? Why on earth all the problems in your life and my life over the years, even tragedies? Does this mean God causes these things? Does this mean God lacks the power to do anything about it? Did God take the eye off the ball? Or maybe it's your lack of faith, my lack of faith. No. Life is a mystery. Toy Wilcox, something just came to mind when I said that. Life is a mystery. We will have a different understanding of what God's sovereignty, what that actually means, and what godly power actually looks like. A big clue is the cross. That is what God's power looks like. There's so much paradox in this. We can't wrap our heads around it because God is involved in everything. I have a really, really, really high view of that. Everything. But doesn't micromanage everything. Again, it's more about us working together with God. One of the theologians called Thomas Ord writes about the uncontrolling love of God. This lack of control actually comes out of respect and love. But again, even that kind of new way of thinking, for some perhaps, that kind of theology can produce anxiety, especially initially. That's why some of us sometimes would rather have a puppet master, God, that pulls all the strings, where everything is preordained, every bit is written before, we're just going through like actors. In the same way, some people feel comfortable within a controlling relationship because it makes them feel safe, even though it can also be very problematic. The obvious thing in our reading today, notice that Paul is in prison, facing possible execution, facing trial, and having been through shipwreck, lashes, a snake bite after the shipwreck, and this blooming thorn in the flesh that he says God did not take away. And the Philippians are facing persecution. This is reality. So when Paul says, do not be anxious, he does not mean that God will take away all of our problems. He does not mean that there is actually nothing to worry about. He says these challenging yet wonderful words like, we can learn to be content, at peace, in all circumstances. Verse 13, really misunderstood verse. I can do all this through Christ who strengthens me. Most translations say, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me, making us think that we can be supermen and superwomen, whatever we do. That is not what Paul was saying. He's looking back. Look what I'm going through. Look what I've been through. I can do all this through Christ who strengthens me. It's an internal thing often. I will protect your heart and your mind, your thinking, your emotions. You will find in me a peace that transcends all understanding. Again, this is about a growing trust and a big view of God, not a little view. Trusting God, whatever happens, God is near. More than near. God is here and here. Thirdly and finally, peace comes from not letting anxiety take control. Okay, we do have limited control, but there are things that can help us cope with anxiety. Those beautiful words in verse 8 onwards, focusing on that which is good, holy, right, pure. And that's more than positive thinking, even though that can be good in itself. And scientists, neuroscientists know now that when we have negative thinking, negative tracks going around, negative tapes, that goes deeper and deeper. So when we criticise ourselves and tell us how rubbish we are, that goes deeper and deeper and deeper. But if we do the opposite, focus on the good, the brain literally changes shape. So much better than those negative anxiety-provoking tapes. Here are some suggestions for our anxiety, and I own it with you, and things that I've found helpful. But I am not telling you these are the answers, because answers can become a burden in themselves when somebody says, just try this. They can produce even more anxiety. The key thing, I think, is that with fear, we get the downtime. The time for the body to recover when the obvious threat has gone. But with anxiety, the mind keeps spinning and spinning and spinning and will take its toll physically. So we need to find ways of resting from it, to have a break, breaking the cycle. Another lovely little quote, and it had a picture of a computer next to it. Almost everything will work again if you unplug it for a few minutes, including you. For me, it's been centering prayer, contemplative prayer. And in that, you learn not to attach to thoughts, to have a rest from thoughts, to rest in God. It can be very, very peaceful. Meditation is very similar. I can't meditate, Mike. I've tried. Yes, you can. Can you worry? Are you good at worrying? If you can worry, you can meditate, because it's exactly the same. It's just the focus is different. Instead of focusing on that thing that scares you to death, it's focusing on something more positive or neutral. Meditate in your way. I hope this is freeing for you, because we can over-spiritualise and make things sound very churchly. Meditate by gardening, by doing a puzzle. I was hearing about the science of that the other day. Doing a puzzle, focusing on something, is actually very similar, what goes on in the brain and the body, to meditating. Knitting, that's a form of meditation. Running, yoga, Pilates, singing. All these things are really good for the breath and getting rhythm. Dance, have a dance in the morning, even if nobody can see you. Go on, I bet some of you do that, I do. Cold water swimming, exercise, but of your type, not a type you think you should do but you hate. Something that's enjoyable for you. Don't beat yourself up. Nature, focusing on that which is holy. Going for lovely walks. Gratitude. It's a tricky one, this, because we don't develop a thankful heart because it's good for us, because that's kind of like getting it wrong. But actually, by being thankful to have gratitude, it is, as a byproduct, so good. And it reduces anxiety. Having Sabbath rest. Building it into our lives. Even when we're putting the kettle on. Having Sabbath rest. Rhythm is so important for human beings. It helps our brain come out of the spin. Alongside this, there are things that we can reduce or stop because they actually make anxiety worse. And again, this isn't a rule list. But for some people, it might be alcohol. Stopping alcohol totally, because amongst other things, it increases anxiety for some. With Alcoholics Anonymous, recognising that there's a higher power, recognising the limits to our own control, but actually something about being able to do this together, but also having somebody in the flesh alongside as well. Maybe not watching the news as much, and I'm preaching to myself here. The habit of looking at the news too much, because I find it fascinating and so scary. I've heard it said that in the olden days, whenever they were, you would hear about a tragedy in your village or a village down the road. So maybe 1 or 2 every 3 years or whatever. We are not built to have all the tragedies going on in the world all the time and watching them. No wonder we are anxious. It doesn't mean we don't try and do something about some of the tragedies, but limiting our intake. I've stopped doom scrolling now. On the phone, the latest news is, oh my word. Better to do something about it, actually. Do not be anxious. Yes, right. Drawing this together, let's focus on the goodness of God. That's a fantastic way to reduce anxiety. Focusing on the love, the grace, the goodness of God. And something that was touched upon in the interview as well. Your goodness. Not picking up on all the things you can't do, all the times you get it wrong, how you're rubbish at coping with anxiety. Focus on your essence, who God created you to be, the image of Christ himself. Don't beat yourself up and add that on top of your anxiety. Let us pray. I'm going to invite Steph to come back as well. Dear Lord, in all of this, please help us. Help us to understand you better and your goodness. Help us to work with you both to improve our internal world, our internal stuff, our hearts and our minds, but also, Lord, from being healthier and stronger and more at peace, to make even more of a difference in the world. Amen. Let's stand together.